So the story of Joseph talks about family, betrayal, hardships, and it also talks about forgiveness. But with all the roller coaster of events that happen throughout this Bible story, there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from the story of Joseph. So I have 3 things that I would like to share with you of basic things that I learned from this story. This is one of my favorite Bible stories, so I'm excited to share these with you. So the first one here is people will hurt us, but God's love will never fail. So where did I see this in the story of Joseph? So let's go to Genesis. And Judah said unto his brethren, what profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let us not our hands be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brethren were content. And then there passed by Midianite merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit, and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. So as you can see from here, Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. They sold him and basically gave him up for money, right? They were jealous of Joseph. They were very upset with him, but their anger and their hatred caused them to basically sell him off. So imagine how Joseph felt. There wasn't a small amount of people. This was all of his brothers who did this to him. These are people who he loved and who he wanted to trust, but they betrayed him and they sold him into slavery, and that seems really hard to forgive. But although there are times where people do this to us, God's love never fails. God would never do that to us. He says, I will never leave you, nor will I forsake you. And there are more promises in the Bible. So let's go together to another one. In Isaiah 30, verses 18 to 19, it says, Yet the Lord longs to be gracious to you. Therefore he will rise up to show you compassion. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are those who wait for him. People of Zion who live in Jerusalem, you will weep no more. How gracious will it be when you cry for help? As soon as he hears, he will answer you. So that is one of my favorite verses that talk about when we go to God and we cry for help, especially in times of despair. He will always be there to comfort us. He will be gracious to us, and he will help us through things, just like he did in the story of Joseph. Joseph clung to God in times of his despair, right? And that's something that we need to do as well. So another thing that I've learned from the story of Joseph is no situation is too big for God to handle. So where did I see this? Let's go back to Genesis. Genesis 39, 2-3, and then verse 5. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord had made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer of his house, and over all that he had. And the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. So this was after Joseph was brought into Potiphar's house. So he was there. This is after he was sold and he was bought. And then he was inside of this house, and God blessed him while he was there. Joseph gave everything that he had to God. Anything that he would do, he would always give glory back to God. And God blessed Joseph in that sense, and everything he touched, it just kind of, it spread from there, right? Anything that Joseph's hands touched was blessed by God. And he prospered, right? And no situation, including that one, was too big for God to handle. He was put into slavery, even though he was bought, and he's still in despair, in the back of his mind. He's always probably thinking about what happened to him when his brothers sold him. That's a lot of hurt, right? So that hurt could very well have been carried through this time, but God still used that situation and the situation that he was put in to glorify himself. God to glorify himself, not Joseph. He did not do that. So not only did this happen at this point, but this happened again later on in the story. After Potiphar's wife accused him of doing some terrible things, which Joseph did not do, he ended up going to prison. And this is what happened after he was in prison. In Genesis 39, 20-23, it says this, And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, and a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hands all of the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. And the keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. And something else to remember and to keep in mind is these people, they didn't believe in the God that Joseph believed in. For somebody like Joseph to go and for his hands to do all of these things and God to bless him and God used him, in a way, Joseph is witnessing to all of these people, because eventually these people started realizing this God that you worship has been very good to you, even though all of these bad things have happened to you and you have been put in such terrible circumstances, but God has always been with you and he's never left you, right? What a way to witness too, right? So his God and the things that he did really stuck with him, and other people were able to see it. And like it said here in this verse, they didn't even have to look over Joseph. They didn't even look at anything that Joseph did, because they knew, right? They trusted him, and they knew how much Joseph trusted his God and that his God always provides for him. And they saw that all that stuff was good, that they didn't even have to take a second look at stuff that Joseph did, because everything was great. In Romans 8 verses 28, it says this, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose." That's a promise for us today as well. In the fact that this stuff happened in Joseph's time, it still happens now, and God is still able to use certain situations that we go through for his glory, and he will not leave us in those times, right? We will prosper when we, stay true to God. And we might not prosper sometimes in the way that we feel like we will, like from a worldly perspective, but everything works out for the good of those who love God. And I think that's the most important part. And here's one of the biggest lessons that I learned, and I think it's the hardest one, and I'm still always constantly having to remind myself of this every single day. And this is that forgiveness is one of the greatest consequences of love. Not only that, but it's one of the hardest ones, like I said, to actually follow through with. To love is also to forgive. And there are things that have happened even in my life that I'm still looking back and I'm like, man, I'm still finding it really hard. It's not the easiest thing to do. One thing that can stop forgiveness from happening, and this is something that I've learned, and this is something that I've also found in the Bible, is that one of the things that stops forgiveness from actually being able to be done is pride. And there are so many opportunities where Joseph would have been able to use his pride, and it definitely could have changed the course of how things happened within the story, and it could have really stopped God from being able to work through Joseph. It says in Proverbs chapter 11 verse 2, "When pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom." So Joseph had every opportunity to heed to that temptation. So when time came, time passed, and Joseph was being prosperous, he ended up becoming second in all of Egypt. Like right next to there was Pharaoh, and then there was Joseph, and he was overseer of everything. And so if you read the story, you can kind of see the developments of that. But at some point, Joseph's brothers ended up having to come to him to get some food, because there was famine in all of the lands, and they weren't able to get any food. But Joseph, when you read the story, you'll be able to see that because of dreams that Joseph was able to interpret, he was able to warn Pharaoh about this famine that was about to happen, and they ended up stocking up and saving food, which they later sold to people during the time of need, right? So Joseph's brothers ended up coming because they didn't have any food. They didn't even recognize Joseph, but I wanted to read to you exactly what Joseph said. There was some other stuff that happened in between, but this is, I think, the most important part. This is found in Genesis 45 verses 4-5. So it says, "And Joseph said unto his brethren, Come near to me, I pray you. And they came near. And he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt." Joseph took this a whole step farther. He didn't just forgive them at this point, and he didn't go and he didn't just embrace them, but he also took it one step further, and he actually comforted them, right? And this is what he said. He said, "Now therefore do not be grieved, nor angry with yourselves that you sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life." Again, even through the forgiveness, he always went back to God. He always did that full circle. And to be able to think of something like that, like not only to forgive somebody, but to literally comfort the person who you're forgiving and to say, don't be hard on yourself for the things that you've done to me. But just, this all happened for the good of everyone. So this whole journey did not happen only for God to teach Joseph a lesson, to teach his brothers a lesson, but he actually ended up saving a lot of people by being able to interpret the Pharaoh's dream and to give them food. So there are times where we don't really know what the purposes of certain things happening in our life is, but if we just trust in God, we know that the things that are happening, God will take care of it, and he will use the situation to further his mission in some way, as long as we do our part. And in 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 8, it says, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. So when I read that story of Joseph, and when, like, that's usually where the story stops there for a lot of movies, or when things make it, that's kind of where it ends. But this verse in 1 Peter is one of the verses that I just think of right away when I think of forgiveness and how Joseph had to forgive his brothers for what he did. He didn't have to, but he did because he loved God. And not only that, he still loved his brothers, even after the things that they did to him. They were his family. And we are all brothers and sisters in Christ, right? There's things that I guess a lot of people have said about me, especially after I was studying the Bible a little bit more, and I started realizing some things. People don't know necessarily that I know that they've said those kind of things about me, but in the end, they're still my brothers and sisters, so whether or not they know, I still forgive them, and it's still hard, but you know, it's just something that we have to do, not for ourselves only, but it's because we love God. So I'm really curious to know what are some other lessons that you have learned from the story of Joseph, and anything that has come up that has been really important to you. But thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have an amazing day.